All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is John Kowalik. I am the practice manager for our modern work business here at Rackspace. And thank you for joining our Microsoft 365 Immersion Workshop webinar today. In just a few moments, Jason Fox, our solution architect, will begin his presentation, but I want to start with a few housekeeping notes first. First of all, we would love to get your questions as we proceed. You can go ahead and enter them into the dialog box for questions in the interface. We'll answer them as we go if we can, and if not, we'll catch up at the end and make sure we get all the questions addressed. Also, please keep an eye on the announcements area. As we proceed, we'll provide the information about how you can receive your free Uber Eats gift card during the presentation in the announcements section. And so with that, I will pass it over to Jason Fox. Jason?
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This is hopefully a good presentation on insider threat protection, specifically using Microsoft 365 and all of the tools available there. Okay, so in the past, not so recent past, but so past for sure, organizations primarily had documents and emails. That was pretty much the only kind of data that was involved. Now we have instant messaging, text messaging, video files, images, things like that. Protecting that data is critical for pretty much every company, and it plays a very important role in a lot of like regulatory or compliance measures and maintaining trust with customers and business partners and employees. At the same time, data breach incidents are frequent. It seems like every day there's a new story involving a breach affecting customers or employees and causing real harm to the companies involved. Only the most notable breaches are become national news, but these breaches happen to companies of all sizes and in every industry. At Rackspace, we and I specifically regularly work with customers who have suffered a breach and looking to improve their approach to the breach as well as the tools used to protect their data. And additionally, discovering and managing that corporate data is difficult. As you can see here, the vast majority of companies don't have confidence in their abilities to detect and prevent loss of that data. Over 80% of the data that companies create is dark, which means not classified, not governed, not tracked in any way, not really known to the business in detail. And 83% of companies experience challenges complying with different kinds of regulations and standards, specifically related to data protection. It's important to note that this process, right, this discovery and management process is cyclical and requires a company to apply these discovery and managing efforts repeatedly as new documents and new data is created, and it requires pretty much constant vigilance on the part of the company to make sure everything is protected. Because of these kinds of challenges, you'll see that it's really critical that a repeatable process for doing the discovery, classification, management, and protection is in place. And finally, the result of this kind of data loss or breach is costly. This is from a study from last year that IBM did, and you can see the average cost of a data breach globally was $3.86 million. Now, obviously, they are looking at customers of all different sizes, so that is a big number, but it's pretty striking how much it can cost. But more than the actual number is the fact that lost business, which includes things like losing customers, reputation damage, things that cause you to lose business you already had or would have had you not had the breach, as well as the efforts used to mitigate the breach. So after it happened, what do you have to do? Do you have to purchase Identity protection for customers. Do you have to recover some sort of IP that you lost? Lawsuits, all kinds of stuff like that. Those two categories make up nearly 70% of that total cost. And so a lot of the effort needs to go into that, into protecting from that data loss in order to avoid those kind of costs. And so while this workshop is somewhat technical, covers some of the technical aspects of protecting data, specifically a technical side of using Microsoft 365 to protect your data, I think everyone can probably agree that technical solutions really require carefully stated business objectives to be effective, right? You can't just have technical solutions devoid of any kind of goal for a customer, or for your company rather. At Rackspace, we spend a whole lot of time with customers to help define their goals prior to any kind of technical implementation work, because it's important to know what the company is trying to achieve before we go into any kind of technical implementation. And we've found generally that data protection efforts, kind of all up, not just threat protections from insider threats, but just data protection in general, needs to consider these four categories, right? So maintaining trust is a big one, right? That's making sure that people you work with and people that work for you can trust that you're protecting their data, and then that affects whether or not they're willing to give you that data in the first place. Protecting revenue, that's protecting everything from the cost associated with damaged reputation and customer churn and lost business that we mentioned, as well as that cost associated with mitigating the breach. That's a pretty critical thing to have. You want to protect that revenue. At the same time, you want to reduce potential costs for the detection and response activities. One of the findings in that IBM report was that automation of detection and response activities is the most impactful change a company can make to reducing the costs of potential breach conditions. And then, depending on your industry or depending on your company, you may need to maintain or achieve some sort of regulatory compliance or certification, depending on who you're working with. Things like healthcare and legal and stuff like that they have specific. If you're in Europe, the GDPR regulations you have to maintain. So that's also figures in a lot of times into these protection the business goals for this protection work. And so at Rackspace, we tend to think of threat protection activities as a constant improvement process. You'll hear me say this quite a bit throughout the talk. Threat protection and data protection is not a one-time thing. It is a cyclical process that repeats over and over again as your business grows, as you generate more data. All of the steps that you'll go through during this journey towards protecting your data will repeat and necessarily repeat. So it's good to have a solid process in place. So what we tend to do is we follow kind of a 4-step process that we go through with customers to help them get into properly protecting their data. The first thing we need to do is discover all of that dark data that I talked about. Discover the data, catalog the data, describe the data, everything involved with defining the data that you need to protect so that later you can put the proper protections in place. We use something called a data protection matrix. That's something that we came up with, but it's really just a digital catalog of your data so that you can work on the next steps more easily. Second, we put protections in place to protect the data at rest. So that means while the data is sitting wherever it sits, SharePoint sites, Exchange Online, email servers, OneDrive, Teams, things like that. So when the data is at rest, securing it in place. And that's usually things like encryption, access control policies, and stuff like that. In Microsoft 365, we use something called Microsoft Information Protection, and it is the process by which you identify and label documents and data so that it can be properly protected at rest. Next, the next most obvious thing is we have to protect that data while it's in transit, and that means data while it moves within your organization as well as external to your organization. So if it travels outside, these are things like emails, sharing document libraries or documents in SharePoint. Teams communications potentially can be external if you have people in Teams from outside of your organization. Third-party SaaS applications. So if your business uses like Dropbox or Box or some other storage medium or data source from a third party, we also have to protect those. And in Microsoft 365, we use Microsoft Data Loss Prevention, or DLP, which covers all of those scenarios and defines how the data can move and what happens when it moves within your environment. And lastly, which is itself cyclical. So not only is this whole protection journey a repeatable process, the detection and response activity is also ongoing, right? So this has to be, this is always occurring and always alerting based on what the system finds. You're monitoring for threats, you're monitoring for detections of threats, you're responding to those threats, potentially false positives, refining all of your alerting and policies in order to reduce false positives but not miss the things that are actually happening. And so for detection and response, we use the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center. It's actually been broken to Security Center and Compliance Center now, and something called Insider Threat Protection, which is a machine learning based policy framework in order to detect specifically events related to insider threats. That's a lot of what we'll talk about at the end of the presentation here. And so for this subject, for these kind of subjects, threat protection and kind of sort of semi-technical kind of subjects, I find it's very useful to use a scenario to talk through the steps. It lets me demo actually what's occurring within the environments, and you can see what we've done. So for this one, we're going to examine this fictional company. If you've dealt with Microsoft at all before, you're probably familiar with the Contoso Electronics brand there, but this is a fictional company, medium size, 300-ish employees, recently transitioned to mostly work from home, which is something I think a lot of us can relate with at this point. They have moved all of their Microsoft 365 or all their productivity services into Microsoft 365, and that migration is complete. So they're fully onboarded to Microsoft 365 from a technical standpoint. And all of their business documents and design files and IP are stored in 365. And there's some concern that because that's all there, they could lose control of it, right? There's a common situation for companies that migrate into the cloud that for some reason when that data goes into the cloud now it's sort of uncontrolled, and so there's a concern throughout the company that this could be lost through either accidental disclosures, so accidental oversharing or things like that, or intentional leaks by disgruntled employees that may exist. So the first step, going back to that journey, is to catalog and describe the data. So first, let's talk about data discovery a bit and make sure we're all on the same page here. This process we found involves three main steps. So the first step is to locate the data. So this is, it may seem kind of silly, but this is actually can sometimes be a fairly challenging part of this process. Is where is all of this data? Now, if you've recently moved and migrated, it could be that everything's in a good spot, but also the migration may have been sort of quick and things were put all over the place. So this is a process of documenting where everything lives, where the data lives in your system. Do you use SharePoint for things? Do you use OneDrive? Are you using Teams, and is that Teams instance that you're using a part of this data? So those are all good things to know. The next step is you have to catalog that data. So you found it, but now you got to really document it. So you're talking about where is it? What types is it? Are we talking about mostly Excel and Word documents, or is there image data? Are we talking about Teams chats? What kind of data is necessary to protect, and how much of it? And you don't have to spend a lot of time on how much, but it's good to know. Are you talking about a very small amount, or are you talking about data everywhere, and you need to put some larger controls in it? And third, you have to describe that data. So once you've cataloged it and what and where, what type it is and how much and everything, then it's good to start describing it. And by describing it, I mean you're getting into the details of what it might contain. What about that data makes it something that you need to protect? Does it have PII in the data? Does it have customer social security numbers or credit card numbers or something in there? Does it have internal private information, right? Or for Kotoso Electronics, right? Do they have project files based on a new project that they have not released that are IP? And if that was released to the public, there'd be some damage, things like that. So you got to describe that data, and by describing the data, you're then making it much easier to figure out what kind of protections need to go into place for that data. And then again, I'm gonna hit on this again. You're gonna probably get tired of me saying that word, cyclical, but discovery itself is cyclical. And having this as a really good process with good artifacts that are generated is important, because you need to continually evaluate the data that you have within your system. Add information to the catalog, because hopefully your business is growing, and if your business grows, then business data expands. You generate more data, and lots of times you'll generate new types of data, if you're entering into a new product. And so you need to continually evaluate that data and add it to this catalog as you go. So this discovery process is an ongoing thing. And that being said, this is actually the most difficult part of this whole process. It involves lots of stakeholders, involves lots of other folks. It involves talking to people throughout the company. It's a lot of hard work in making sure that you've got this correct. But it is absolutely critical, because time spent here means the accuracy and the coverage you get later, as well as the lack of things like false positives and things. It contributes directly, right? And so getting this correct right now is critical. And so we tend to spend a lot of time with customers on this particular activity to make sure that everything's in place for the next steps, which are primarily technical. With Microsoft 365, the result of all of this is we use something called sensitive information types to describe, to rather notate the descriptions in Microsoft 365. So once we've got everything cataloged and described, we can then look at defining sensitive information types for the data that we've found, and that's a specific part of Microsoft 365. And so this, what do we mean by sensitive information types? Microsoft includes about 100, and I forget what it's up to now, sensitive information types that out of the box. So these are well-known information types or patterns that it uses to detect things like driver's license numbers, credit card numbers. You can see maybe in that screenshot things like the Australian driver's license number, things like that. And so because of all that, you can use those sensitive information types if you're trying to protect that kind of data. So if all of your data is well-known examples, then you're good. You can use those information types. There's also the ability to define custom information types, things like, you have a certain pattern for your customer numbers. You may have internal projects, like we said, Contoso Electronics may have some internal project code names or something that they need to use, keywords that mean a lot within your system. So you can define those as well, and that allows you to do some customization on that. Defining these sensitive information types is the final step in that discovery process that we talked about. And so you can see this discovery process is, like I mentioned, complex, lengthy, lots of discussions, lots of talk between uh, everyone at the company to find the proper amount of data and how to catalog it. So because of that, we can't really show those deliberations today, right? Like it's a lengthy process. So we're going to say for scenario's sake, we made a decision that we need to protect credit card numbers and things related to an internal project called Project Obsidian, right? So those are the two pieces of data or things that we're worried about protecting throughout our system. Luckily, we have the default sensitive information type I mentioned before to identify credit card, so that one's done. We can use that information type and further policy definitions, but we do need a custom one for the Project Obsidian data because that's specific to our company, or to Contoso. And so the next step is to use Microsoft Information Protection to protect the data at rest. And we do that through labeling. So information protection labels are define how you use the sensitive information types to like broadly categorize documents, files, and sites, and teams, and all kinds of stuff like that. Labels are defined for a set of information types, and they can do things like apply encryption in place, um, implement access management rules, or even do things like content marking, where you'll put a watermark onto a document. Labels can be manually applied, so you can have users actually go and apply a label to a document while they're working on it. You can have suggestions for labels, so where the system will automatically suggest, like, this looks like maybe you've got some credit card numbers in here. Would you like to mark this as confidential? And then you can have the system automatically apply it, regardless of the user's choice. If it detects things like a credit card number or something, it would apply a label that would then encrypt that document. All of that is a decision or is based on the policy configuration you make within Microsoft Information Protection. And all right, and so I think we're at a point here. So we're going to do a little demo. We're going to show the sensitive information types as well as the information protection labeling. This shared here. Okay. So you can see here we're in our tenant here for Contoso Electronics. And we're here in the data classification portion of the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. In this section here, this is where you define the sensitive information types that apply to your business. As you can see, here are all of the Microsoft related ones. There are, like I said, 100 plus of them, of the included out of the box Microsoft ones. We know we're going to use the credit card numbers, so we don't really need to show that. But I do want to show that we did create a information type for Project Obsidian. So this is one, you can see the publisher's Contoso. This is one we created custom for ourselves. It protects the content, and it does so via a keyword list. So you can see there's a patterned keyword list that we created for Project Obsidian types of data. And it detects any kind of data and any kind of supporting data within 300 characters. So that means it needs to see, it will look at anything related to this Project Obsidian thing. Further, you can see that the data classification system actually allows you to do some content exploration once you've defined those sensitive information types. So if we look here, we can look at the Project Obsidian information type, and you can see that the system has identified 2 email messages and 5 documents within SharePoint that match this sensitive information type. So if we go in here, you can see that for the Project Obsidian label, there in this SharePoint site, the specific SharePoint site, there are these 5 documents that have been identified as the Project Obsidian information type. And these are, obvious things that relate to specifically to that project. And then if I move over into the information protection section, you can see the labels that we created based on those information types. Here. So you can see there are some default out of the box labels. So these are labels that come from Microsoft, things like personal and confidential. And we've created, because this is IP, we've created this highly confidential Project Obsidian document, or label rather. And this label is something that covers files and email. So you can see in the scope there's files and email. It applies encryption, content marking, labeling, all of those good things for anything that it identifies as Project Obsidian. And it does that because we've used, let me see if I can look here real quick. We've used the labeling, uses this sensitive information type that we created earlier. So we created the sensitive information type, right? That's the defining discovery part. And now we've protected at rest using that information type. And it automatically applies the label and encrypts the data. All right. So for this is like a review of the journey so far. So we did the data discovery, and now we've completed the at-rest encryption. So we've created that label to encrypt email and files with anything related to the Project Obsidian sensitive information type. And the next step that we need to do now is protect that same data in transit. So we're going to use data loss prevention rules to protect the data in transit. So we should talk about what data loss prevention policies include. So the role of the DLP policies are to identify any kind of actions involving the protected data, so the data that we've already identified, whether it's shared internally or externally, and then it defines what happens to that data when that event occurs. So should it be stopped? Should you stop the share right away? Should it be limited? Should a user be notified that they're doing something wrong? Or should it be logged? Something like that. DLP. The purpose of DLP is to enforce these company policies to avoid both accidental and intentional leakage. So it's not always to just prevent people from doing bad things. A lot of it is just to prevent people from accidentally sharing more data than they intended to. And one kind of cool thing is that it does provide, DLP has, within the Microsoft Office applications, has something called policy tips, which can be used to teach users about the data sensitivity during the risky action that they're taking, right? So you can see in this screenshot here, so somebody's trying to send an email to an external email address with a Project Obsidian document attached. And so the policy tip says, hey, this data should not be shared. Please remove it before sharing. You could have that be just a suggestion, like say, hey, this is not a good idea. You should, think about this before you do it. Or you can have it be an enforcement. So like this specific policy tip is a tip, but also if you try to send it, it will fail. It will not allow you to send the email with that data until it's removed. But the tip helps inform the user what's going on, but also helps build good habits. And that's a big part of what Microsoft has done with their DLP policies is they're trying to get everyone involved together in protecting this data versus this just being sort of a top-down administrator kind of role. And then, so DLP, as we'll see in the demo in just a minute, DLP policies really cover the where, when, and how of in-transit data protection. So where do you want it protected? When do you want it protected? And that means things like, is it only external, only internal? Does it have to occur a bunch of times? Occasionally may be okay if once or twice, but more than that may indicate that it's a data theft problem. For internal things, right? You could have it say it's not unusual for people to share these kind of documents once or twice, but if they'd done like 100 in the last 24 hours, maybe we should block that and alert on that, things like that. And then how? So again, you warn, notify, block, any kinds of things. As a caveat, before we get into the actual demo, for ease of discussion, the DLP policy, the two we're going to look at, are relatively simple, and they only really scratch the surface of what DLP can do to protect data. DLP can reach into all kinds of areas. It's not easy to demo and show all those different options. So just know this is a fairly simplistic DLP rule, and your DLP policies will likely be more. There will be more of them, and they'll be more complex in order to properly protect. And with that, we can get into looking at DLP rules. Let's see here. Okay, so back to this scenario we had. If we look in the data loss prevention area, we can see that we have created some policies. Specifically, we created two policies, one for external sharing and one for internal sharing. So the external sharing policy, you can see, protects documents. So this is Project Obsidian stuff. So it's using that same sensitive information type labeling. So it protects those documents, and it protects them within Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. So this is external sharing. These are the only areas that you can externally share that we have this data. Contoso has this data in those locations. And then you can't see it from this screen, but it blocks sharing. So basically, if a document has Project Obsidian, it cannot be shared externally. And we've done that because this is an internal project only, and there's no reason to share it. For the internal sharing policy, this one is a little different because you're talking about preventing people from putting the documents into locations you don't approve of, right? And so again, it covers Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, but it also covers something called Microsoft Cloud App Security, which, if you're familiar with the technology, is Microsoft's version of a cloud app security broker. And its purpose is to extend all of these protections that Microsoft has into third-party SaaS applications. So things like, again, Dropbox and Box and any kind of storage, Google accounts, things like that, so that sharing doesn't occur outside of the areas you want it to exist in, right? So we're making sure Project Obsidian data is only placed in a specific part. Otherwise, all access is blocked. So you can see here, we have this in place. So there are, we can look at some alerts that were generated here. So like we had a policy match for this document. Our friend here, Megan Bowen, has put this budget reporting spreadsheet into SharePoint, but she's put it into the wrong area. So you can see details on it. We can say she put it into a document library that was not for Project Obsidian, so it popped this alert. You can look at things like the event, so you can see things like details around what happened, who owned it, who did the work, where it was put. You can see it was put into this leadership site, whereas the Project Obsidian data must exist within the Mark 8 site, and so it's noticed that. And then you can see it notified the user, generated an incident report and alerts, and it actually blocked access to that file. And that's pretty much it for DLP, but I did want to show the policy tips. So we're in the email account for Megan. So we're going to use her. She's kind of functioning as a bad actor in our system here, unfortunately. But we can do things like we can send an email to an external entity, right? And say project. And then we can attach a file. So let's attach like this acquisition playbook. And then you can see immediately Outlook puts the policy tip here. So it says Project Obsidian data must not be shared outside our company. Please remove it before sharing. And it won't let me actually send it. It will block it from being sent. So that's how those policy tips work. They work in everything. So they work in all of your Microsoft Office applications as well. So in Word, if it feels like it has something, it can let you know that it needs to be protected. It can automatically apply those protections if necessary. Okay. Back to the presentation. Okay. So another review. So we have finished the data protection and transit step of our journey. So we've created the two DLP policies we mentioned, the internal and external sharing policies. And the next step is to look at ongoing detection and response. Now we've looked at a little bit of that because I showed like alerting and response and policy tips. That's part of the detection and response setup. Specifically, we're talking about detection and response using some of the machine learning capabilities of Microsoft 365, specifically around insider threat protection for the purposes of this talk. So it may seem kind of odd, honestly, that we're this far into this workshop on insider threat protection before we even talk about define insider risks, right? We're 40 minutes in here, but a lot of what we did previously is sort of applicable in general data security, and so it's the building blocks for protecting against insider risks. But for the detection and response activities, like I mentioned around insider risks, it's helpful to define what we mean by them. Generally, two types of insider risks. There's data leaks, so these are generally accidental, not malicious attempt. That this is an instance when someone accidentally overshares or puts a document someplace that's not well protected, and the data leaks from the company. And the second is data theft. So this is in particularly around authorized users, because there's lots of data theft from non-authorized users. If you're talking about breaches and things like that. But we're talking specifically about people that generally already have access to this data and are then stealing it, either intentionally exposing it or stealing it before they leave, or if they're just a disgruntled employee in general. So in Microsoft 365, we monitor and alert on insider risks using insider risk management. And within that, we create insider risk policies, all both aptly named. The policies trigger alerts, and those alerts can notify administrators and risk managers and employee managers about a thing that has occurred. An alert does not mean that the activity that it detected is absolutely an insider threat. It means that it detected something anomalous, and that it wants you, and then it asks the risk management folks to confirm that this was an actual real thing. Part of what you'll see is when you get started with insider risk management, because policies take a while to mature, initially you may get a lot of false positives, and you got to tweak the policies to deal with how users within your system may use the data, so that you're not getting alerted on every little thing that happens. Once the alert is validated, so once you look at an alert and say, yes, this is a threat, this is something that I don't want to happen to my system, and this looks suspicious, you can then create a case. So you create a case from an alert, and it centralizes and aggregates all of the alerts for a specific user into a location within the Microsoft 365 system, so that people like case managers and legal and HR and risk managers can all act on this specific case, centralizing both the investigation and the collection of data, so you can put it all in one place, so that you can further determine if this is an actual problem that needs mitigation, right? Like, we got the alert, we confirmed that this does look suspicious, so let's build a case on it. And that case can be used for things like audits, and if you have regulatory compliance, where in the case of an incident you need to do X, Y, and Z, then those cases can actually be used to cover that process for you. And that's pretty quick on that, and we're going to dive right into the demo, because I think the demo is probably one of the more interesting parts of insider risk. So let me pull that up here. Okay. So we are again back in our Contoso tenant here. So we're back in looking at the tenant that we've done. We have first, so this is your overview, and you can see there's lots of stuff on here, which we'll talk about in a minute, but let's go first to the policies. The policies, we've created some policies in here for two reasons. So first one is Project Obsidian, right? We want to make sure that there's no accidental oversharing of Project Obsidian. So this Project Obsidian policy is around general data leaks. That's what when we talked about previously, that is the sort of not intentional, accidental overshare kind of leaks. And so this is something where we're looking for incidents that may be accidental, but are still worrisome, right? In addition, we have some reason to believe that this one of our employees, Alex here, who is leaving the company, for whatever reason, we have reason to believe that he may be trying to steal some data, or he may be disgruntled, and that's why he's leaving, and we're worried that he may try to steal data on his way out, right? So we've created a specific policy for Alex. It's unlikely that you'll ever create a policy targeted at a specific employee, but you have the ability to do that. More likely, you'll have general data theft policies that you can apply. For this example, it was much easier to target a specific employee because it gets the alerts going a little faster for demo purposes. All right, so back to our alerts. So you can see we have 3 alerts here. So we have a Project Obsidian alert for our friend Megan. Unfortunately, she's again the subject of some worry here from our threat protection system. And we can see that the system has detected 3 exfiltration activities, right? So that's files shared externally from SharePoint Online. You can see that's what happened. It gives you some details about the user. It gives some alert details when it was detected, things like that, and then some of the stuff around what content was detected. You can go and look at the activities in the user timeline, and we'll actually show you exactly what she did. So, for instance, she externally shared this file from SharePoint, meaning she created an anonymous link. So that's important. It's not It's not just that you send it to somebody's email. If you create an anonymous link that allows sharing, that's considered at that point shared, right, externally. And then it gives you information about what the document was, where it went, which site it was in. So you can see this is actually in her personal site here. Client IP information, things like that. Which workload. So she actually took her involved OneDrive in this as well. So we looked at this and we said, Megan's not that bad of a person. She seems like she's doing the right thing, but this does look like it's potentially a problem, right? And not a problem in that Megan is doing something bad, but something that we need to protect against, right? And so because of that, we went and decided to create a case for this particular incident. So we've got this data loss case created for Megan. Again, it centralizes all the stuff that we just looked at as far as what we've detected and things like that. It shows the related alerts that were generated that we may need to look at. It shows all of the user activity. For the user, it can even show you, right, this is more important for the intentional problems where you maybe want to look at 6 months of data. Is this a constant thing that happens? Is this exfiltration, is her risk score for exfiltration super high over the, maybe nothing for 6 months, but then the last month just skyrocketed? Things like that you may want to look for. So you can look that in the user activity area. You can look, Activity Explorer is what we already looked at before, that lets you get details about all of that kind of stuff. You can look at content. So this is the content of the things that were shared. So you can look right here. You can see what it is. So this is a Word document, right? You can look at what was in this Word document and what potentially was shared without having to go into the system and find the thing that was shared. You can actually just see right here what it was. You can centralize case notes. So we don't have any case notes, but if you were going through this case and I talked to Megan and she accidentally shared this in the wrong thing, things like that, you can put case notes in here, and then you can add all kinds of contributors. So you can add, like, this is where you would add risk management folks or HR if needed involved, things like that. So that's for that one. For the alerts, the other two alerts, right? We've got our buddy here, Alex, and so he has triggered both that potential data theft alert that we talked about, as well as the same Project Obsidian data loss one, and you'll see why in a minute. So we can look at this case. You can see the severity for him is high, and that's it's primarily because of the frequency or the number of times an event occurred. Megan, it was only kind of 3 exfiltration activities. He's had 8, and they were very quick. And so that puts him into a high severity. So we can see he had, again, exfiltration activities from SharePoint. He downloaded these files from SharePoint. So Alex is working on a managed workstation, which means that workstation is plugged into Office 365. It's running something called Microsoft Defender for Endpoints, which is their endpoint detection and response software that reports back here. And so it's tracking what occurs on the local versus just things that happen in the cloud. All the rest is the same. User details and alert details are all the same. You can see it detected 3 Project Obsidian info types as well as an ABA routing number. So there's definitely some concern with those kind of labels. If we look at the activities in his timeline, you can see that there are 8 files downloaded from SharePoint, and you can see they were all downloaded within the course of 3 minutes. So he downloaded a ton of data to his local machine. And you can see, because it's again a managed workstation, you can see where it was, is downloaded from and to, and you get that file downloaded event that occurred. And then it even tells you that it's triggered both of these IRM policies for this one file download event. So we've got the 8 events in there, and then 4 of those events. So you can see these are the 8 files that were downloaded, and you can see these 4 have sensitive information types assigned to them. So you can even go here and just look at the ones that have sensitive information types. Again, get all of the data that you had before. And then curiously, the next day, a bunch of files were deleted from the system. And so that is, again, worrisome, right? He's downloading a bunch of stuff and deleting a bunch of stuff. So this is worrisome activity for Alex here. And we can go back in and just show real quickly. This triggered the same alert that Megan had for Project Obsidian, because some of those files, again, some of the files that he downloaded had the Project Obsidian information type. So it's going to trigger both of the insider risk alerts. It's a good example of sometimes it's good you can put these in place and maybe there's overlapping policies and you can reduce some of the noise by doing that. Additionally, which is kind of neat, you can actually look at users. So these are users that may have not tripped any kind of risk alert, but you can add users to watch. So if we have some, maybe Joanna and Joni are leaving the company, and we don't think they're going to do data theft, but as a part of our protection strategy, maybe it's required, for instance, by regulations. We want to watch them. So we'll go and see Joanna and see what has she done, right? We can pull activity. And so, for instance, we have this data exfiltration event that's how she's downloaded a bunch of files. But you can see she downloaded 42 of them, which is not uncommon for SharePoint to download files. But 0 of them have any sensitive information or labels applied. And so this is not worrisome because you can see the risk score is only 5 of 100, because this is something that happens in normal SharePoint usage. So we're not concerned there. And so you can go in and kind of investigate those, which is interesting. Okay. All right. All right. So that got us through our demo of the insider risk management portion. These slides go here. Okay. So again, review, we used insider risk management to create those policies to protect that Project Obsidian data. But unlike the labeling or DLP policies, which just did like events and alerts, insider risk policies and the insider risk management system allowed us to examine like the aggregate user activity and to look at risky behavior outside of just a single event, right? So you can look at events and correlated events and other activity for users to determine if that risk behavior is something that needs to be stopped or something that needs to be dealt with. And all that's possible, like we're using the power of the Microsoft 365 system as well as the machine learning and stuff that's available for everyone to automate that detection of the abnormal activity and then allow us to investigate and determine if it is real or not. All right, and so that's the end of our journey. So we can review here, right? So we did our data discovery, catalog and describe the data we want to protect, right? So we were able to do that correctly. We looked at protecting that same data at rest using information protection. So we created the sensitivity labels and policies. We protected the data in transit using DLP, Microsoft DLP. And so we created those DLP policies and tested them. So it's one thing we didn't really get into because it's DLP policies take a little while to test. Like you have to put them into place and it can take a few hours to generate alert testing. But part of a good DLP policy implementation is to test them, to put them into a test mode so you can see what would happen. How would you put them in place before you just sort of inflict it on the employees within the company. And then we set up the detection response. We created the risk policies and monitored them, right? And so this is, again, not done. The risk policies are in place, but then now the monitoring is is constant, right? And so we'll get notifications, and you'll have to go and look, create cases, dismiss alerts, things like that. So this is an ongoing activity that your security or risk management or administrators will do. The nice thing is the Microsoft 365 tools make that fairly easy. And that is the end. So that's all I had to talk about. And I think I don't know if we have too many questions, but I'll take a look and see. You can feel free to ask them now if we don't have any in there right now to answer.
Jason, I don't see any at the moment, but folks, if you're interested in putting a question in, please go ahead and do it now. And also take a look at the announcements section in your interface, and you will see the link in there for the Uber Eats card. So I'll just give it a few minutes and see if we get any questions. I think there's one there, Jason.
Okay, yeah, we're getting a few through. Okay. Do I recommend any additional auditing software is the question. It depends a lot, right? I don't think that there's a need for additional auditing software if what you're trying to protect is the Microsoft 365 environment, right? The cloud environment that you have. The Microsoft tools are pervasive and they work well across it. If you have other regulatory reasons for having auditing software, healthcare industry, for instance, I don't think you'll get away with just saying, I have some DLP policies. You're going to have a little bit more. We touched on it a little bit at the end, but using Defender for Endpoints as your endpoint detection and response software on all of your managed workstations for users is a big help, because that does provide additional auditing that is outside of the cloud. So that gives you a little bit more information about what folks are doing with that software. But overall, no, there's if what you're trying to protect is your data within the Microsoft 365 environment, I don't think there's a big need for any additional auditing software. Is data in Office 365 protected against ransomware attacks? To a degree, right? Like one big thing about using SharePoint and OneDrive is that you have versioned files. And so if you're storing all of this data, all of this important data in the cloud in both SharePoint or OneDrive, then ransomware attacks that attack specific workstations won't have an effect, right? You can just wipe the machine, put a new operating system on it, and go back and download all your stuff from OneDrive and SharePoint, and you'll have it back again. So the ransomware, and that effect, it nullifies the effects of a ransomware attack versus kind of protecting against it. However, back to what we just talked about as well, the Defender for Endpoints does protect against ransomware attacks. So that allows its antivirus, endpoint detection response, anti-malware, anti-ransomware. It's all bundled into one product that's built into Windows. And so that does actively protects against ransomware attacks, and will feed information back into your system. So that Defender for Endpoints will feed information back into the cloud system that allows you to do things like, if a workstation is compromised, has been compromised, or has a ransomware attack, you can choose to not let that particular workstation, access any of your cloud stuff until it's been fixed. And so there are all kinds of complex scenarios there to protect against ransomware in particular. Okay, next one. Can I send a document to an external contact but revoke their access to that document at a later stage? Yes, sort of. So you can't, once it's left you can't. So you cannot sort of recall it, obviously. Anybody who's dealt with Exchange at any time knows the silly email message recall doesn't really work because people probably have already looked at it and it doesn't work. So no recall, but if you put policies in place that protect this data up front, you can do things like have detonation times or access limitations on external sharing. So we looked at blocking, but you can do things like say, this document can be looked at externally by these people, but only for 30 days, or can only be, used, can only be read, can't be printed, can't be things like that. So that's where I would recommend you focus. Any experience with similar capabilities for orgs who supplement M365 with Slack? A little bit. Rackspace used Slack for quite a while. These kind of policies you can use MCAS to protect parts of Slack. Slack has its own data loss prevention capabilities that are separate from Microsoft 365. And most of my experience, which is somewhat limited with the actual Slack integration, I've seen most people just adopt the similar policies within Slack rather than trying to make Microsoft 365 protect Slack. It's generally a little easier than trying to get the full integration working. Okay, I see many third-party companies selling Office 365 backups. Is there any value in investing in additional backups? Man, that is a loaded question, right? It depends. It's a hard. I hate answering questions with depends, but it does depend. Office 365 has there's a lot of internal things within Microsoft that protect your data, and there's lots of SLAs, and they duplicate your data and protect it internally. But that may not be enough, right? So a lot of it is, if that's not enough for you to feel comfortable, then backup solutions are absolutely worth an investment. There are also regulatory reasons, particularly I believe in Europe. We've heard a lot from customers about the need for a backup system that pulls this data off of Microsoft and puts it somewhere else. So rather than just trusting that Microsoft is backing everything up and you're not going to lose data within the system, you want to pull it somewhere completely. What I will recommend is that you look strongly at how the restoration process goes for that kind of backup, because just backing up the data is wonderful, but if you need to restore it back into Office 365, you have to make sure that that works properly. We actually have, very shortly, we will be launching a backup product at Rackspace. We believe in it enough to offer as a product. So if you have the right scenarios in place where you need that kind of support, then yes, it is. There is value in it. This one may be for John or someone else. Do you give Uber gift card or Uber Eats voucher? I'm not sure. I think they looks
Yeah, I'll
like.
jump in. So I'm not sure what the right terminology is. We'll get the information and we'll send it individually to each person that submits that form in the announcement page. So go into that announcements page, enter the information, and you will receive your Uber voucher, I guess maybe it's called, in your email.
Yep, that is correct, John.
Perfect.
Okay, those are some good questions. If anybody, we've still got a little while here. If anybody has any other ones, I'm happy to answer.
I think we're good, Jason.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending. As a reminder here, at Rackspace, we have a bunch of targeted what we call jump starts and workshops and things to help get most out of Microsoft 365. We talked a lot about data protection and security here, but we do everything related to Microsoft 365, things like migration assistance, identity access management, config, phishing and spam protection, any kind of device management you need and config around that. And we specifically have guided workshops that go into more detail. So this in particular, we have one that takes you through the threat protection journey that we outlined today. So where we work with you to take you through those steps to implement threat protection on your behalf. If you go to that, there's a link at the bottom there, that rackspace.com/LP/Microsoft 365 Jumpstart that has more information as well on those things. But thanks for attending, and hope you have a nice rest of your day.